For those of you whom I have not had the opportunity to meet, I'm George Murray. I'm the Bishop of Youngstown, Ohio, and a member of the Society of Jesus. Thank you, Anthony. I'm happy to be with you today, and I'm sorry about being late. There was some confusion on schedules about time, and then there was a parking problem outside, which is still not resolved. My car may be towed, but we'll see. I was asked to say a few words about the history of African American priests, much of which I'm sure, looking at this audience, that you already know. I'm going to rely heavily on Father Cyprian Davis's book and also on Sister Carolyn's book on Augustus Tolton, and then some of my own research on James Augustine Healy, the Bishop of Portland, Maine. The history of African American priests actually does not begin in either Africa or America. It begins in Rome. It begins with Pope Gregory XV's creation of the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith in 1622. The propaganda, as it's known, owed its origin to the need to initiate missionary activity in the colonial nations. You remember that that period of history was a period of great colonization, and as the various European countries reached out to the New World and reached out south to Africa, there was concern in Rome that missionary activity accompany the political journey that the various countries were taking. A guiding principle of propaganda was the importance of establishing a native clergy in each colonial country. Therefore, they encouraged the various countries, France, Portugal, Spain, England, to develop native clergy and to encourage them to serve their own people. However, in the United States, the idea of a native African American clergy was strongly opposed not only by the people, but also opposed by the ecclesiastical leadership. Therefore, not very many African Americans were welcomed into the church, and even fewer became priests. Now, as I came in, I noticed some slides that were on the wall, and someone mentioned to me that you've seen them a number of times. And what's important about those slides is that, at least in some of them, they had pictures of the first African American priests in the United States, who were three brothers, all of whom were children of a free Irishman by the name of Michael Morris Healy, and his common-law wife, Mary Eliza, who was a slave. Healy had come to the United States after serving in the British Army in the War of 1812 and had settled in Georgia, where he took Mary Eliza as his common-law wife. There's no record that the two of them were ever even attempted marriage. In Georgia, they could not get married by law, but other people would leave the state and come back as husband and wife, and even in Georgia that was recognized. But there's no record that they attempted to do that. They simply lived together as common law husband and wife, to the best information that we have so far. Michael Healy and Mary Eliza had 10 children, all of whom were, by the laws of the United States, legally slaves. 3 of Michael's 4 sons, his eldest sons, became the first African American priest. The oldest was James Augustine Healy, who was born in 1830. The second was Patrick Francis Healy, who was born in 1834. And the third was Sherwood Anderson Healy, who was born in 1836. James Augustine and Alexander Sherwood Healy both became priests of the Archdiocese of Boston. Patrick Francis Healy entered the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. James Augustine was ordained a priest on June the 10th of 1854 after studying in France. And it's interesting to note that the reason that those three men became priests was because of a friendship between their father, Michael Morris Healy, and the Bishop of Boston, John Fitzpatrick. It was Fitzpatrick who encouraged Michael Morris Healy to send his children to Holy Cross College in Worcester, where they had the experience of being taught by the Jesuits and where they found an opportunity to go to France and to study for the priesthood. As I mentioned, James Augustine Healy was ordained on June the 10th, 1854. He had studied in Montreal and then had gone to France and studied in Paris. On his return to Boston, he became the personal secretary of Bishop John Fitzpatrick. He was later named Chancellor, and eventually he was named Vicar General. In 1875, James Healy became the second Bishop of Portland, Maine. He was known as an excellent preacher, a hard worker, and an industrious pastor. Patrick Francis Healy taught as a Jesuit scholastic or a Jesuit seminarian at St. Joseph's College in Philadelphia and Holy Cross College in Worcester. He was ordained a priest in 1864 and began teaching philosophy at Georgetown College in Washington, D.C. in 1866. In 1873, he became the vice president of the college, and in 1874, he was named the president of Georgetown College. Healy is remembered at Georgetown as the second founder of the university. Georgetown was founded in 1789 by John Carroll. And at the time that John Carroll founded Georgetown University, the Jesuits, sad to say, had been suppressed by the Vatican. I have no idea why. I can't help you on that one. But anyway, the Society of Jesus had been suppressed by these evil people in Europe who didn't understand what we were trying to do. And the Jesuits in what was called the Maryland province decided to maintain their property, and they changed the corporate name from the Society of Jesus in America to the Roman Catholic Gentlemen of Maryland. That way they didn't have to give up anything. And interestingly enough, if you ever receive a letter or a check from the Maryland province of the Society of Jesus, it still says the Roman Catholic Gentlemen of Maryland. That's the official corporate title of the Society of Jesus in the Maryland province. Carroll founded Georgetown College in 1789, along with Holy Trinity Parish in Georgetown, and it continued as a college until the late 1900s, when Healy transformed it from a small liberal arts college into a university by upgrading its departments, especially the social science departments, and by organizing a medical school and a law school. Alexander Sherwood Healy was ordained a priest in December of 1858, and 2 years later he received a doctorate in canon law from the Lateran University in Rome. Bishop John Williams of Boston chose him to be his personal theologian at the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1866 and at the First Vatican Council in Rome in 1870. Upon his return to the U.S., he was named rector of the almost completed cathedral in the Archdiocese of Boston. By all accounts from the period, James Augustine Healy and Alexander Sherwood Healy both possess distinct African features. In a letter that Bishop Fitzpatrick sent to Archbishop John Hughes in New York, he talks about the African descent of Sherwood Alexander Sherwood. And if you read some of the documents from the tenure of James Healy in Portland, you see that people recognized and talked about the fact that he was of African descent. It doesn't seem to have mattered to many people because, for one thing, there were very few African Americans in Maine. He was a person who was very easy to get along with. He didn't seem to be at all threatening. There was one pastor in the Diocese of Portland who objected to him and made his life very difficult, but they finally reconciled, and there's no indication that there were problems beyond the reconciliation. So James Augustine and Sherwood definitely, from all accounts, had distinctive African features, while Patrick, the Jesuit, who was the second founder of Georgetown University, did not. And in fact, Patrick was told by his Jesuit superiors not to reveal the fact that he was of African descent. So he kept that secret all of his life. In the history of black Catholics in the United States, Cyprian Davis says, the Healy brothers unquestionably take pride of place. But they did not reveal their African origins. In fact, the evidence indicates that they did everything possible to conceal their origins. None of the brothers spoke out at any time against discrimination against blacks or entered into solidarity with the black community. The reasons for this are unclear, but they are also very apparent. It is apparent that they did not associate with the small African American Catholic community of the time, or African Americans in general. Other members of the family, if you trace the family history, three of their sisters entered the convent, one left, two others stayed, and then there are others who got married. The family simply, as was said at the time, passed. They passed for white and moved into white society. And it was very interesting. I happened to be at Georgetown in the 1980s, and there was a revival of interest in Patrick Healy. And one of the stories that was in the Washington Post was that the descendants of his brothers and sisters who married were not even aware of the fact that they had African ancestors until some research was done at Georgetown University. They had simply passed over into the white race and were continuing to live that way and had no idea of where they had come from. So they were surprised to... Well, it was a little bit like Strom Thurmond. The first black priest to be recognized as black was, of course, Augustus Tolton. Tolton was born a slave in Missouri in 1854. His mother was a devout Catholic. His father left the family early on. At the beginning of the Civil War, his mother moved the family to the free state of Illinois, where they lived in the midst of poverty and virulent racism. Still, Tolton's mother persisted in insisting that her children go to the Catholic school, the Catholic elementary school in Quincy, Illinois. And it was there that Augustus Tolton first made known his interest in becoming a priest. Two pastors in Quincy, both Franciscans, encouraged and tutored Tolton as he grew. And he finally was able to get into Quincy College as a special student. And in 1880, through the influence of the Minister General of the Franciscan Order, Tolton was accepted into the Urban College in Rome, which was and still is run by propaganda. The original idea was that Tolton would not study for the Diocese of Alton in central Illinois, which is now the Diocese of Springfield, but that he would go to Africa as a missionary. All of this changed when the Cardinal Prefect of the Propaganda, Cardinal Simeone, decided that he should return to the United States. And in a letter that he wrote, he talks about how he saw the United States as a progressive country and thought that it would be important, following the principles of the Propaganda, that people minister to their own, that Augustus Tolton return. Cardinal Simeone was a great patron and friend of Augustus Tolton all through his life, and Tolton was very appreciative of his care and concern. So Tolton was ordained a priest on April 24th, 1866 at the Cathedral of St. John Lateran in Rome, and returned to the U.S. in July of that year. After celebrating Mass in Hoboken and in New York, he returned to Quincy on July 18th, where he celebrated Mass at one of the German parishes in the city, St. Boniface. It was reported at the time that the congregation, that the church was packed to capacity, and that the congregation was comprised of approximately 1,000 whites and about 50 African Americans. And in one newspaper report, it points out that the majority of the African Americans who were there were Protestants, not Catholics. The Bishop of Alton, Bishop Peter Bates, appointed Tolton pastor of a black Catholic parish with the name of St. Joseph, but the number of black Catholics was very small, and in some of his letters, Augustus Tolton talks about how he felt himself to be a failure because he had not attracted a large number of Africans to convert to Catholicism. Very soon after Tolton got there, an interesting phenomena developed, which many of you who are in African American parishes can easily relate to. Tolton's parish was so lively, and his homilies were so good, that whites from other parishes started coming to his parish on Sunday. And yes, you got it. That was not popular. And so especially some of the German pastors in Quincy became very upset about that. And as one pastor wrote in the local newspaper, he was uncomfortable about his parishioners going to the Mass celebrated by the colored priests. This priest and others brought pressure to bear on the bishop, who eventually allowed Tolton to accept an invitation from the Archbishop of Chicago, Archbishop Michael Thean, and move there. He had been offered an opportunity to go to 3 other dioceses, but he decided to accept the offer in Chicago, mainly because of the fact that the Catholic community, the black Catholic community in Chicago, was of a substantial size, and they had been asking him repeatedly to travel to Chicago to celebrate Mass for them, so he knew many of those people. He moved to Chicago in December of 1889 and founded what was called at the time a Negro parish at 35th and Dearborn, which was dedicated to St. Monica. Also involved in that was Mother Catherine Drexel of Philadelphia fame. One of the many outstanding people from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. You're right, exactly. Moving right along. Yes, thank you there, Ed, thank you. Augustus Tolton never enjoyed good health. He was always rather weak. It was never clear exactly what the cause of that was, but as he became more involved in Chicago, and especially with the demands of fundraising that were upon him, his health began to suffer. There are also indications in his letters that he was afraid for his physical safety. He never identified exactly what that fear was. He talked in rather broad and vague terms. But he did mention his concern about his physical safety. And the other thing that comes across in his letters is that he suffered from a deep sense of personal inadequacy. He never thought he was good enough. And as a result, he was always trying to keep up with the other priests in the diocese, and he was very hard on himself. You see that in his letters about his work schedule, which was breathtaking, the amount of work the man did on a daily basis. But he never felt that he was adequate. Tolton, from a historical standpoint, can be faulted, and was at the time, by, for example, the leader of the Josephites, the superior of the Josephites. He was faulted for not being aggressive. At one point, Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul, Minneapolis, had been interested in Tolton coming there. And that fell through when he went to Chicago. But then Ireland wrote to the superior of the Josephites saying, do you have a Negro priest who could come and work with our people? And he said in his letter, I don't want someone like Augustus Tolton. I want someone who will speak up for the community. And so he was he seemed to be a very mild-mannered person, which attracted a lot of people to him and made people comfortable with him. But there were others who criticized him for not speaking strongly enough to advance the cause of the African-American Catholic community. Augustus Tolton died on July the 9th, 1897, after collapsing on the street while walking back from the train station while a heat spell was affecting Chicago. He was only 43 years old, and he is buried at St. Peter's Cemetery in Quincy, where a large cross marks his grave to this day. After the death of Tolton, there were a number of other African Americans who came forward to study for the priesthood, and most of them were located at St. Augustine Seminary in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, which was opened specifically for the purpose of training African American men for the priesthood. On May 23rd of 1934, the first 4 African American priests were ordained, and they were Father Vincent Smith, Father Francis Wade, after whom a school is named in Chicago, Father Maurice Rousseff, and Father Anthony Burgess. Each one of those men, interestingly enough, became bishops, but none of them served in the United States. They were all sent to other places where it was felt they would be more readily accepted. And then, of course, the history goes on in terms of African Americans entering many, many orders across the United States and continuing on that tradition that was in one sense begun by the Healy brothers, but certainly formally begun by Augustus Tolton. Now, because this is a symposium on vocations, I think we need to ask the question, what motivated these men to face the difficulties of studying for the priesthood and facing racism in the United States? What appears in their writings are 2 interrelated motivating factors. The first is a profound love for the Catholic Church. When you read the writings of someone like James Healy in Portland, he talks about the church with great passion. And some of these early priests, Francis Wade, did the exact same thing. There is clearly in them a love of the church, of the teachings of the church, and the ministry of the church. But there is also a second aspect which is related to the first. And this second aspect, unfortunately, does not apply to the Healy brothers. But to those who came after the Healy brothers, there was a sense of personal responsibility for contributing to the future of the African American community, and specifically the African American Catholic community. They saw the church as being an effective tool, not only for evangelization, but also for moving forward the African American community and calling for racial and social justice. If we take those two aspects, love of the Catholic Church and a sense of personal responsibility, and I want to emphasize personal because that was a big issue with each one of them, that they had a responsibility, not just the order, not just the organization, not just the institutional church, but that they had a personal responsibility for contributing to the future of the African American community. If we look at that and then compare that or even contrast that to people, to young people today, we can see where some of the problem comes up. Within the African American community, at least, and your experience may be different. In my experience, I find that fewer and fewer young people are involved in church issues in the African American community. When we have gatherings, not only as Catholics but also other groups, they'll talk about the youth. But if you look at the numbers, they are going through the same thing. The African churches, African American churches, Protestant churches, are going through the same thing that many of our churches are going through. It's a graying process. Many of the people who are involved are older, and the youth don't have that sense of the power of religion to transform lives. And that's broader than the African American community. White teenagers are the same way. I mean, many of them feel that an iPod is more influential than the church. But many African Americans don't have that sense that African American youth don't have that sense that that someone like Martin Luther King Jr. exemplified that the greatest and most effective tool for transforming society was the gospel and the faith. Many of them don't have that. Secondly, among our youth, and again, this is not only among African American youth, this is among white youth, Asian youth, same thing. There isn't as much of a desire to make a personal contribution to the future of the community as there has been in the past. We see it in broader context with things like the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps goes up and down. There are years when you can't get into the Peace Corps because so many young people have applied. Then there are other years where there are lots of openings. And it seems to, some of it varies with the economy, some of it varies with the sense of self-actualization in a society. But there is a movement which I think we can see clearly in society, which is much more internal. There's a focus on the self, a focus on my being happy or my family being happy, and not as much of a focus on we have to stand together as a community. Now, I've certainly heard a number of black leaders say that they feel that Hispanics are much better at standing together as a community than we are, either historically or presently. And that Hispanics will come together to move the community forward. But I do think that when we look at our own African American youth, and if we're trying to encourage vocations, I think that we have to be honest about the fact that they don't see, not only the Catholic Church, they don't see the church, they don't see religion, for the most part, as being the catalyst for social change. And they don't feel a personal responsibility for moving that social change forward, so much so that they would make a sacrifice to be involved in an institution that they would see as focused on social change. There's some of the historic issues, or two of the historic issues which I think come out in talking about contemporary vocations vis-a-vis the experience that we've had of the history of African Americans who decide to pursue the priesthood. There's no question, and this is all through the history, there is no question that these men, like the four that were ordained by the SVDs in 1934, and also Augustus Tolton, courage was an extremely important part of their experience because they simply faced enormous amounts of disregard, lack of concern, and outright racist hostility. And many were caring of them. Those two priests in Quincy who cared for Augustus Tolton and who got criticized for doing it. The insults that were hurled at Catherine Drexel's nuns as they went from a school for black kids to their convent, people driving by in their cars, calling them unbelievable names. They kept going, and they kept doing their work. And many of us are products of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. Well, these men did the same. And they went to places where they were rejected and dismissed and not taken seriously. But they had the courage to go forward because they believed that the church was the major instrument of social change and that the gospel would call people to justice. I think one of the things that we have to work on is re-inspiring our young people to recognize their personal responsibility to carry on the saving mission of Jesus Christ. But that's not something that simply happens in Rome, that the Lord left that mission to open the eyes of the blind, to open the ears of the deaf, to help the lame to walk, and to preach a year of favor from our God, and the good news to the poor. He leaves that to us, and that we have to do that, and our youth have to do that, and that by them getting involved, we can make a difference for good in our society. And I think it's important that we help them to love the church and to remind them that anyone they love has faults, and that when, as William James so well put it in a great essay on which he called On a Certain Blindness, that when Jane looks at John, Jane knows the faults of John, but she overlooks them because she loves John. Well, we all have to recognize, if we're going to be honest, that the church, like any other human institution, has made mistakes and has faults. But the church is the voice and presence of Jesus Christ. And what we have to do is show people the Lord and help them to see God who is present. And I think we have to help our young people to recognize their responsibility and to love the Church of Jesus Christ and to want to be a part of it so that that church can bring about the saving mysteries and the saving effects of the presence of Jesus in our world. I think that the story of African American priests is a wonderful story and very encouraging. It is a story of courage, it is a story of great determination, and it's a story of great hope. Young people, again, and part of our contemporary society is we don't have heroes anymore. And I think that we've lost something by losing identifiable heroes. But I think these men can be heroes for our young men because of their determination and because of their courage and because they wanted to make a difference for good. So I think it's worthwhile for us to talk about them and introduce them to these men. And I think it's important that we continue to pray for and support each other on our own journeys, because as we all know, racism has not gone away. It continues to affect us. It continues to tear at the fabric of the unity which should be ours as African Americans. And the more we stand together, the stronger we are, as the early priests stood together. We should never leave someone as alone as Augustus Tolton was. We should stand with each other and support each other so that the gospel can be preached, Jesus can be known, and God can be all in all. Thank you.